this is the section of the conference which deals with help available at the moment, but we're not taking it too seriously. The speakers come from organisations deeply embedded in our community and in trying to make things better, and they're bound to stray into what should be done in the future, which is the overriding subject of our conference. They'll speak for about 7 or 8 minutes each, and then hopefully we'll have a while for your questions and responses. So please save up any questions until after the speakers have finished. So I'll press on with no further ado. Our first speaker is Andy Winters, I dare say you all know him. He's Chief Executive of our largest local voluntary sector organisation tackling homelessness on every level, an organisation that under his leadership has been responsible for a lot of fantastic work over many years. Andy.
Thank you very much. This, I think, is my last outing in my role as I retire in January after 37 years at BHT Sussex. So it's great to end on a high, I think, at this forum. My focus will be on homelessness and the prevention of homelessness. But first, a question. Why are we discussing this today? In fact, why do we need to discuss? That's 2 questions, I just realised. Why do we need to discuss this? It's because in one of the richest cities, in one of the richest countries in the world, when some people have so much, we have people without a home, and we have people sleeping on our streets, and others who are facing homelessness, poverty, and destitution. Homelessness is not a natural phenomenon. It's most unnatural. It is an engineered byproduct of a political system that continues to fail, and it has never failed as much as it has in recent weeks. 37 years ago, when I started at BHT Sussex, there were roughly, talking very generally here, 5 different cohorts of people who would come to us looking for a service. They were care leavers. They were people escaping violence and abuse in the home. There were people with alcohol and then later drug problems. Those with mental health problems and ex-service personnel. Today, the same 5 cohorts are presenting themselves on a regular basis to our services. But there is a 6th group who we hadn't seen until the introduction of austerity in 2010. There were people who find themselves homelessness purely for economic reasons. People who in 100 years never thought they would need a service from an organisation like ours. They're people who might have been in relationships and the relationship breaks down and one of the partners moves out thinking they will find somewhere else to rent, only to find that the rents in a city like Brighton and Hove are completely beyond their means. We have people who come to our day centre, First Base, who are sleeping in their cars. They come, they have a shower, and then they wash. I put clean and dry clothes on, I put the kettle on, and I get some food out of the cupboard for breakfast. But if you had slept on the streets of Brighton last night, there is no toilet, there is no shower, there is no kettle, there is no food in the cupboard. Fortunately, there are some brilliant services in Brighton who do support people at their lowest moment. Places like the Clock Tower Sanctuary, Off the Fence, First Base Day Centre, Sussex Homeless Support, who a special word should be mentioned, who were outstanding during the lockdown, supporting people in the hotels. And I don't think people would have survived that if it wasn't for that exceptional organisation. And there will be others represented here today, and I apologise, I probably missed naming you, and you can come and beat me up afterwards for forgetting to do that. But we need to stop people getting onto the streets in the first place. Last year, through our advice and support services, we prevented 1,777 households from becoming homeless. 506 of those were in Brighton and Hove, over 1,000 were in East Sussex and a few in West Sussex. We run a court duty scheme in the Lewis, Brighton and Hastings county courts where people who are facing losing their home will arrive very often never having spoken to anybody that they were on the verge, on the cusp of homelessness. They're people who have never had advice There are people who arrive with a bag full of unopened envelopes from their mortgage company, from their landlord, or whatever. And they don't know how the court system works. They've just received a summons. Fortunately, the court usher will direct them to our solicitors and our advice workers in the court, who will then take an immediate instruction from them and seek a deferment. Sometimes it will be an hour or two, sometimes it might be for 2 or 3 weeks. We can then do a proper review of the legal merits of their case, and we can then prevent homelessness. So the bulk, well, not the bulk, the majority of the cases, 688 cases, were through our court duty scheme and our advice services where we prevented homelessness. We do a lot more than that. BHD Sussex has the First Base Day Centre, as I mentioned. We have a phase 1 project. Addiction services, a range of mental health services, including Shaw House, that has been in use recently because of the situation in Port Slade. There are other amazing organisations. I've already mentioned Sussex Homeless Support. There's the St Thomas Fund, Sanctuary, Rise, Clock Tower Sanctuary, CGL, St Mungo's, Sussex Night Stop, YMCA Downslip Group, Brighton YMCA, Mankind. And I know I've missed some again, and again I do apologise if I haven't mentioned your service. None of us are perfect. Some of us are a long way from being perfect. We're aware of that. We always try to improve. We try to get feedback to see what have we done, have we done it as well as we should be. I've run out of time, I need to stop. I will finish off with 4 very brief things. We need to act on behalf of our clients without fear or favour. We need to ensure that there are no delays of even 1 hour from helping somebody off the streets. We need to campaign jointly for the building of council houses in their hundreds of thousands, and we need to campaign for the end of the right to buy. We need to demand from our political leaders what they're doing to end the scourge of homelessness. And there is a Latin American priest who I will quote. By doing this, we might make ourselves very unpopular. But this priest, Don Helder Camara, once said, "When I feed the hungry, they call me a saint. When I demand to know why are they hungry, they call me a communist." So whatever the damage to our reputation, we mustn't hold back. We must speak truth to power. And together we can hopefully one day bring an end to homelessness.
Thank you, Andy. Pressing on quickly, our next speaker is Helen Bartlett, who is the Hub Co-ordinator for Brighton and Hove Community Land Trust, who's a sponsor of this conference, and will talk about to us about what we see as a major hope for our future, community-led housing.
Thank you. I think it's important to say here, we're not directly an advice service, although that is a function that we would really like to fulfil. So what we do more is we try and support and campaign for community-led housing in the city. We see community-led housing as a potential solution to the housing crisis that we're in. And so our vision is there, a city where all current and future residents, regardless of their income, have affordable and secure housing, and where the people of the city have homes that reflect their diversity and creativity. Local people have genuine control and choice in how they live, and the city makes the best of its resources. And so community-led housing, for those who don't know, is a way in which groups of people come together to find shared solutions to their own housing needs. So it could be about creating housing that's affordable and secure for low-income people. It could be about creating homes for LGBTQ+ people. We work with groups who are working with young disabled adults. But the critical thing is it's groups of people who are working together, often with the council and with the state, but kind of taking control of their housing themselves. And it takes different forms, housing cooperatives, community land trusts. We've heard a lot of such horrific stories. Homelessness is so much the sharp edge of the housing situation we're in, but I also think it's really important to look at it so widely. You know, housing is inaccessible for what is becoming the vast majority of people in our city, right? So these are some statistics, and they're from the 2019 Brighton and Hove City Council Housing Market Report. The reason it's a bit out of date is because that's the last one that was published. That an average 3-bed house, so it's worse now, an average 3-bed house costs £481,703, and so to buy it requires an annual household income of £109,999. The median gross household income in Brighton and Hove is £29,100, with 33%, a third, earning under £20,000. So that means that, like, buying a house is out of reach for so many people if there isn't like family and hereditary wealth there. And meanwhile, average rental costs at that time took up 68% of the median household income. And we also know about some of the other problems in the kind of private rented sector. More recent analysis we did for a kind of scheme that we're building up showed that the market rent for a 2-bed property is £1,584, and the current local housing allowance, which is obviously frozen at the moment, is £1,000. So it's just becoming so difficult. And for us, one of the ways that we look at that, and that's been touched on as well, and we'll come back, is in who owns our city, because we know, right, we know that there is development happening, we can see it everywhere, there are cranes everywhere, so we need to ask the questions of like what's being built, for whom, is it providing affordable housing, is it providing the housing for the people in the city who we want to live here, who is our city for? We would really recommend that people have a watch of Push the Film, which is about the financialisation of housing. And I think later, Jim referred to him, Councillor Matthew Brown from Preston is going to look at their community wealth building model. Community wealth building is one of the, I think it's the 4 strategic priorities of Brighton and Hove City Council at the moment, so they are looking at it too. And what he will talk about is a way that we can start to look at land and property through a lens of what benefits the community and the city rather than kind of through extractive wealth purposes. I'm just going to show you, this is a housing co-op that exists in the city. It will tell you, so a housing cooperative is a form of collective ownership. It's made up of its members, they're the landlords and the tenants. And this is a housing co-op called Bunker Housing Co-op, who are building homes on council-owned sites, really, really beautiful, sustainable eco homes. Their aim was to build high-quality homes for low-income people. Can you show the video? That would be amazing.
Is there a video?
Yeah, there's a video. There should be a video.
Oh, I don't think someone sent me a video. So I have jumped on it, I haven't got that. I can see if I can grab it quickly.
Oh no, is it not embedded? All right, I can tell you about it if that's like. So Bunker Housing Co-op, you can look it up. It's as I said, it's an organisation that's looking at building high quality homes for low income people. They're working with the council on sites, small infill sites that have been identified as possible for housing development. So most of them kind of have, you know, the potential to build 2 to like 6 homes on them. They are a group of people who are project managing it, working with architects and so on to kind of build these homes that will remain, because they'll be cooperative owned, so they're super sustainable, really like energy efficient, which is obviously the rest of the homes that we should be building, working in a partnership with the council for a nominations agreement and so on. And as I said, because they're cooperatively owned, they don't ever move into like private ownership, so they're never subject to like things like the right to buy. They always remain like that. So that's an example of a co-op that is doing it at the moment. The council does support community-led housing, and there are sites that are coming. Through. We have what's called a community-led housing pathway, where kind of again those small sites and groups go and have a look at the sites and see if what they look like is suitable for their needs. At the moment, it's a lot of quite small sites, because obviously one of the things here is, or one of the things that is said here is that, you know, there's a lot of competition, especially for land in the city. I think where we as an organisation would like to go, there are cities, countries in the world in which forms of community-led housing, and especially housing cooperative, are so much more predominant. In Vienna, I think a housing cooperative form 40% of the housing stock of the city, and that's because of like governmental and local governmental policies that have kind of supported that as a way of building and developing. So I think what we're looking at is kind of using the small sites as a way to move on and say, let's do something bigger, and let's look at, if we were to look at something again, and what we're saying at the moment is, if we were to look at something through a community wealth building lens, what would we do differently for land and property, and how would we kind of do that together? And very quickly, this is another project that we're like working on at the moment. Student housing is obviously conflictual in the city. I think often people see students, the studentification of the city is kind of part of the problem of housing. We kind of spin that a bit and look at it a bit differently, which is that students are also kind of our young people. They're often some of the people who are the most subject as well to like really, where landlords take advantage of like their youth and inexperience, and are subject to really awful living conditions. And so we work with a group, so we have this partnership in which the CLT raised money through a mortgage and a community share issue and built a house that we leased to CSOL, and we see that as kind of supporting the next generation of co-operators and of people who kind of subscribe to those values and are involved in those movements. So we bought a house in Moulscombe. We looked at kind of buying hotels. We bought a house in Moulscombe that was already a house of multiple occupation, because obviously we know one of the issues in some of the areas is that kind of conversion of family homes into HMOs, and we didn't want to feed into that. But what we're doing is supporting a project in which those young people kind of really they want to engage differently with their local community. You know, they see it as being, it's not just about affordable housing, it's about how we like work differently in groups and with the kind of communities around us. So yeah, I think. Cool.
Thank you very much. I really do think that that's a very important part of the way forward. Thank you for telling us about it. Okay, our next speaker barely needs introducing in this city. It's Tim Worthley of Arch Healthcare, which specialises in taking care of homeless people.
Thank you very much for having me. My name's Tim Worthley. I'm one of the GPs at Arch Healthcare, which is, as you see there, it's a Brighton-based not-for-profit specialist healthcare provider. And our mission is to explore every opportunity to improve the health and well-being of people experiencing homelessness. We hold a contract to do that until March 23, but there are talks ongoing about that being extended, so we hope to have good news for people soon. And in 2019, we were awarded an outstanding CQC rating, achieving outstanding in all 5 inspected areas, so one of the very few surgeries in the whole country to get that. So, and what's lovely about that is that we know that we are providing not just decent healthcare to people who are experiencing homelessness, but some of the very best healthcare in the country, which is, I think, very, very important that we all aspire to that sort of excellence. And it was a very proud moment for us. Just to go back and tell you things that you already know, I'm sure, which is that people experiencing homelessness in general across the country attend A&E 6 times as often, they're admitted to hospital 4 times as often, and they stay in hospital for 3 times as long compared to the general population. Being homeless is really bad for your health. We know that very often people become homeless because they have serious health problems, and then they remain homeless often because they have serious health problems. And then if they didn't have health problems when they became homeless, they often then develop health problems whilst they're homeless, or get more health problems. It's a real health issue, being homeless. And we can see there, 50 times more likely to have hepatitis C, 12 times more likely to have epilepsy, 6 times more likely to have heart disease, 5 times more likely to have a stroke, 2.5 times more likely to have asthma. It's just so bad for you. And that's one of the reasons that we do need a specialist home service that's able to care for people who are developing all of these different conditions much younger than really they ought to be. We talk about trimorbidity, which is a horrible medical term, but it basically means that often when people are homeless, we find that they have sort of a combination of mental health problems, physical health problems, and substance misuse problems. And that's all in the context of very insecure housing and the stress that brings. And just imagine how difficult that is to manage. Really sadly, the average age of death for a woman who's homeless in this country is 43, and for a man who's homeless in this country is 47. And consistently over the last 10 years, as we've been monitoring the stats in Brighton, we find very similar ages in Brighton despite our best efforts. And if you are homeless, you are 9 times more likely to commit suicide than if you aren't. So that's all very depressing, isn't it? And again, telling you things that you already know. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about what Arch do, and then I think when we can get into questions later about what we would like to do in the future, because Andy touched on that earlier, there is so much good that we feel that our organisations, all of our efforts do, but we're also always painfully aware of how much more we could be doing and how much better things could be. So at the moment, if you look at the homeless healthcare landscape in the city, we have Arch Health, that's us, and we provide a GP surgery. And if you just go to the next slide, Dan, is that right? So that's us there. We have about 1,300 patients at any one time. We offer about 14,000 appointments a year. Every year we get about 500 new people register with us and about 500 leave. So we stay consistent at around the 1,300 and 1,400 mark, but we get to know a lot of people every year and try and offer them the best care that we can. In fact, we see about 1,300 different people every year. On average, people that register with us will see us about 10 times. So it keeps us very very busy. We have about 12 or 13 GP clinics a week, 12 nurse clinics, 4 healthcare assistant clinics, 1 physio clinic, and some off-site sessions. So we squeeze a lot into that time, but again, we're painfully aware of the fact that we would love to be offering much more, and there are days where we do turn people away, sometimes in significant numbers, which is just the most horrible feeling for any healthcare provider, and particularly for us. And Dan, if you could just pop back a bit, is that right? So what Arch do, we have that healthcare surgery, but we also, we're really lucky that as part of our contract we're able to offer more than that as well. We have a health engagement team which is provided by Just Life, who are the most wonderful organisation, and they will see over 150 people a year. They will offer about 4,000 contacts, and they're primarily for people in emergency accommodation, but not just, and they're about helping look after them when they come out of hospital, helping them connect with health services, helping them with other things as well. And obviously Just Life provide an awful lot beyond their health engagement work, but they've made a huge impact in the city. And what we found was offering that level of support meant that people were far less likely to be readmitted to hospital once they come out. We also have a hospital in-reach team as part of our contract, which is provided by a Dr. Chris Sargent, and a couple of nurses and a wonderful team leader. And they trawl the wards of the hospital, finding anyone that's been admitted who's experiencing homelessness, and they provide extra special care and advice and support to the teams that admitted them about how to look after them, and then they facilitate a much safer discharge. And they work with over 300 people a year on the wards and provide a truly, wonderful service. So as well as that, we provide outreach clinics in the community. We're running with YMCA, we're running a step-down bed project at the moment, so people can be discharged from hospital a bit sooner than they otherwise would have been. We run conferences in the city, and also we've been really involved in COVID vaccination. We're just about to start another round of COVID vaccinations with some other partners. We also run multi-agency healthcare meetings. So that's what we do, but then there's some other wonderful homeless services, healthcare services in the city, such as the mental health homeless team, such as the substance misuse service, and all the others that we work alongside. Just really briefly, if we go to the next slide, and then the next one. This has just been to touch on what we want for the city, because we're, as I said, painfully aware of what we're not doing. This is a map just to show where some of the different settings are in the city for people who need to access health support. And we find that in the average day, someone might need to walk as many as 6 miles just to get to a few different services. And we believe very firmly that that's not good enough, that it's unfair, that it's introducing barriers, and it makes trying to get out of homelessness, it makes that a full-time job, let alone all the other things you need to do just to stay alive and to stay safe. So what we would argue needs to happen, and we can talk about this a bit more later, if we just go on, sorry, down to the final slide. We think there needs to be a homeless healthcare hub in central Brighton that brings all of these teams together, that has a GP service, there's a mental health service, that has a community nursing service, or I didn't mention the Sussex Community Foundation Trust homeless team, which is a big list, but that's a wonderful group of nurses, physios, OTs that go into hostels and other settings and just do amazing work. So they would be with us. We would want some misuse workers with us, the health engagement team, and we'd like to host housing workers and benefits advisors and social workers. And it could be a real hub of activity. We could run courses, run classes, there'd be a cafe there. We think the city needs it consistently. We are the second highest ward or borough, what's it called, in the country for levels of homelessness. We have exceptionally high levels of drug-related deaths and suicides. And when is this city really going to get imaginative about how we can have a coordinated, structured response to this? Because the problem isn't going away, and it's not going to go away until we do things differently. And we believe firmly that this is one of the ways things could be done differently. And I will stop talking there.
Thank you so much, Tim. We wholeheartedly support that idea. Coalition has been pushing its own version for a good few years now. So our final speaker, I'm very glad she could come. It's Helen Bradburn. She's a senior housing specialist at Lawstop. We're a firm of legal aid solicitors on the Stane, specialising among other things, housing and community care law. I'll hand over to Helen.
Okay, so I think the main issue that everyone knows right now is that property in Brighton, it's just not affordable. And why has that happened? So in particular since COVID, I think everyone knows that there's been an influx in the city, people moving in from London because they can now work from home. And what's that done for everyone else? Well, it's raised the prices. So what we're seeing at Lawstop is an increase in a number of things, some of those being evictions based on rent arrears because people can't afford their properties anymore, and also a rise in no-fault evictions because guess what, if your landlord thinks that they can get more money, they're going to kick you out and they're going to rent it to someone else who's going to pay more. So we heard obviously before about the local housing allowance rate, and what does that mean for everyone that lives in Brighton? So at the moment, a one-bed property on average, just 2 days ago, was going for £1,322 per calendar month. The local housing allowance rate for it is £797.81. That means as an individual, you have to find an extra £500 a month in order to pay your rent. Most people can't afford to do that. In particular, if you're on benefits, your universal credit allowance isn't even that. So all it's doing is pushing everyone further and further out of Brighton because they can't afford to stay here. The other issue that we're seeing a lot is an increase in disrepair, because if your city is oversubscribed and you can get more and more rent, you also don't really need to have your property at a particularly high standard in order to rent that out. So you'll see in Brighton and Hove there's hundreds and hundreds of properties that have mould issues, that have damp issues. I've never known a city to have so much single glazed properties as there is in this city. And again, it's causing people to have further health issues, and people can't really do very much about it. The other thing that we're seeing is a rise in unsecured tenancies. So people can't find tenancies in the usual ways, because when they're going to viewings, they're being beaten out by other people. So people are turning up at viewings, and other people are offering them 6 months in advance or 12 months in advance, or they've got guarantors, or they're just offering them more rent. So we're seeing a rise in property guardianships and also subletting. The issue with both of those is that when it comes to you being evicted, there's very little protection that you have. So what do we also see in respect to homelessness? So the issue is that the worse the quality of the city housing stock is, and the more expensive the city housing stock is, the worse it's going to be with individuals who are homeless, who are being placed into emergency accommodation. Because when the council place someone into emergency or temporary accommodation, the law quite clearly states that suitability has a big basis on the housing stock in your local area. So what that means is, if Brighton housing stock is bad, Brighton Council are able to place you in subpar accommodation because that is the general housing stock. So what do we do at Lawstop? Basically, we're trying to challenge all of those things. So we work with evictions, we try and stop Section 21s, we try and stop Section 8, so that could be your possession cases, your ASB, and Section 21 is your no-fault evictions. We also work challenging issues with homelessness. So as Daniel mentioned earlier, the council, they like to say people aren't in priority need. They like to say people don't have a local connection, people are intentionally homeless. All of those decisions can be challenged, and sometimes it does take coming to a law firm or going to someone like Daniel for them to sort of listen and take some action. The other things that we do is we do also challenge a lot of issues with suitability. So just because someone says, well, the condition of the property is this sort of way, that doesn't mean we have to accept it. We can challenge that, and we do challenge that. One of the issues that is a huge problem, though, for us is we are a legal aid provider, and legal aid is getting smaller and smaller. So back in a couple of years ago, about 5 years ago now, the legal aid provisions got cut. And what that means is they reduced the amount of legal aid that's available in housing drastically. Disrepair, you can only get legal aid for disrepair is if your home is likely to cause death or serious illness. Now that's a very high threshold. Property in Brighton is very bad, but it probably doesn't meet that threshold. However, it is still available, but the issue is accessing it. So before 2018, Brighton and Hove had one legal aid provider. Right now, it has two. Considering, as you've just heard, the number of individuals that are homeless in Brighton compared to the rest of the country, that's quite shocking that there's only two legal aid providers here. But it's slightly better than other parts of the country where there are advice deserts and people are having to travel sort of 70 miles to be able to speak to anyone about their housing issues. But it is getting slightly better. We're trying to change that. Lawstop, we've opened up 8 offices now. We opened in 2018 with 2 offices, and we now have 8 offices. We're trying to make it more accessible for individuals, and we have a lot of telephone appointments, in particular since COVID, because another thing that a lot of people probably know is it's very difficult if you're homeless to stick to an appointment because you can't charge your phone, you can't remember all the time to go somewhere because perhaps you need to be on the other side of the city at a food bank so that you can eat that day. So we're trying to make it as accessible as possible for people to come in and see us and speak to us, or call us and speak to us. So as well as that, one of the things that we want to do is we want to move forward. So we at the moment have very much been challenging individual cases. So if you come to us and you're homeless, we'll challenge that. If you come to us and you're in an unsuitable property, we'll challenge that. But one of the things that we definitely need to start challenging is the policies. So in COVID, we had one very successful case where we challenged Brighton and it actually changed the law across the whole country. So that was the case of N-Cube, which some of you may have heard, but it meant that all councils had to house everyone during the pandemic, even people that were no recourse to public funds. Since then, what we've done is we've actually hired a head of public law, and the intention is that we start moving into a place where we can start challenging real policies and start helping in a more central way rather than just individuals in a firefighting method, although we will still continue to do that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That's amazing work. I'm really excited to hear what you're doing. And I think now we can move to questions and answers and comments from the floor. I think.
I've got a question. Andy Winter, sorry to hear that you're retiring, or you'll be a big loss in the city, believe me. Looking forward for the rest of us, is there anything you advise? How do we make the change? Is there something missing? What is it we've not done so far to try and cut what looks like an obvious Armageddon coming towards us?
I don't know. I'm an optimistic person, always have been, but I probably am at my lowest ebb at the moment about the state of the country, the state of politics. I think that there's a technical expression that people in high management use called shit show. There's a complete and utter shit show that we're dealing with at the moment in national policy. Unless there is a fundamental change in government policy, and I said in my presentation, unless we build council houses in the hundreds of thousands, unless we abolish the right to buy, unless we really absolutely reverse of housing policy going back since Margaret Thatcher's time. And I'd like to see us go back to Harold Macmillan's time when he was housing minister, when they were building 400,000 homes a year. So I'm just trying to say, I'm not being partisan here, that he was a conservative. We just need hundreds and hundreds of thousands of homes that people can afford to rent. Without that, it's going to get worse, and all we can hope to do is to prevent homelessness and alleviate suffering and harm on an individual basis, like your organisation does, prevent homelessness like Hannah's organisation, we're the other legal aid provider in the city, and try to prevent homelessness, but it is on an individual basis, and we need a systemic change, and it needs to happen at the heart of government. Sorry to be so. If the system worked, if the care system worked, if child protection was effective, if mental health and generally addiction services were better than they are, if there was proper support for veterans, there would be no need or less need for services like those provided by BHD Sussex. And I always hope that we would one day make ourselves redundant.
We'll take some more.
Anybody got a question for anybody?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, thank you all. And interesting to hear, you talk about systemic change and policy change. So just like we are one of the co-secretariats for an APPG, which is an all-party parliamentary group on household and temporary accommodation. So we really agree that policy change needs to happen. We'd be interested to talk to anyone who wants to hear more about that. But Hannah, really, but also everyone else, you talked about addressing policy change, and I wondered what your thoughts are around that, like how you're thinking about going around about doing that, and also how we do that as a collective of people who have expertise and interest and lived experience, particularly in this area.
Does anyone want to address that? Or shall we?
Mr. Hannah.
Thank you. So, in terms of how we do it, it's generally through judicial review. So taking it to the High Court and letting them decide that something's wrong. The way that we are sort of addressing certain things is we need a good test case usually. I know that sounds like an awful way of phrasing something, but it's the strongest circumstances that are going to make it the best and the most powerful. It's also then having a catalogue of individuals and cases and housing providers as evidence to show this is a systemic issue. So it's making sure that we take note of every single individual that comes forward, making sure that we keep records, and once we feel that we, have strong enough case, then we take all of those and we take it to the High Court. So I know, obviously, in Brighton and Hove, there's tons and tons of issues, but I guess the worse the cases are, they definitely need to sort of come to sort of legal providers so that we can start to take note of them and start building cases so that we can actually then challenge it in the sort of legal setting.
Richard? Thank you. Yes, I'd like to pick up on some of the points that Andy Winter made, and in fact, if his memory goes back that far, he will have heard some of this at hustings for the general election in 2015, I think. So, anyway, let's start. Very few people know, for several years, the government, yes, this one that's been in place for 12 years, has been running an operation called One Public Estate. The purpose of One Public Estate is to gather together a database of all land in England, possibly in Wales and Scotland, I'm speaking for England, and which is held by any kind of public body, the army, the NHS, councils, etc., etc. And now comes the bad news. This current government's intention is to then parcel off the land from that collection of One Public Estate to private residential developers. Everyone can draw their own conclusions. Coming back to what Mr. Winter was saying, sadly I missed the key word secure rented social housing, which means, providing you behave yourself and pay the rent, you've got a home for life, which is very important when you're bringing up children, that they're going to schools in the neighbourhood, they've got their friends, etc. Not sure about managing 400,000 homes a year anymore, but certainly 200,000 so that we get 2 million built in 10 years, at the end of 10 years' time, would be a wonderful target. And if any nitpickers say, oh, 2 million, perhaps it's a bit more than we need, no problem at all. If it's 10% more, if it's 15% more, they just get rented out on the open market. Not a problem. Because part of the policies of our governments, whether we like them or not, are mobility of labour, to attract companies from abroad, because we are there, or we're almost there, as being the cheapest place in Europe, despite the English Channel in between, to actually run a factory, to run a production unit. So mobility of labour is an important thing, but we can only have mobility of labour if that labour has somewhere to live. Sorry, it's stating the obvious. Just to round off on our own city, it's well known, I think widely accepted, that we do, well, first of all, how much housing do we need for Brighton and Hove? We have about 18,000 social rented units spread between the council and various housing associations. When you look at the economic profile of our population, with many people in low-paid, gig economy, zero-hour contracts, we probably need about 30,000 more secure rented properties. That's a total of 48,000 secure rented properties. Where do we get them from? Our council, our politicians, have to go to the government and say, Brighton and Hove needs to be set up as a 25-year housing action zone. And what happens in a housing action zone? Every single property, land, commercial property, houses, first of all has to be offered to a housing action board to buy in. And the housing action board, at market price, no worries, and then the housing action board has to look at that. For example, industrial units, you can often do a lot with industrial units, rebuild the ground floor, build 4, 5, 6 stories of flats above it. Not difficult. And if during the period there's not enough property coming on the market to create the 30,000 homes that City needs, then, and again, not doing anyone down, the council turns to those rented properties, private rented sector, does a deal with each landlord to take the property off their hands, to buy it in. Better than market price, 10 or 15% premium, so the landlord can reinvest the proceeds of the sale in whatever other profitable business they want to move into. And at the end of that, we then have enough secure social rented housing for our population and for the levels of income in our population. And in the 7 years since those hustings in 2015, I have not heard a single councillor, I've not heard a single local MP recognising that that is the action that ultimately needs to be taken. All the rest that we're hearing is all good, and it's essential because everyone has to live from day to day, but longer term, I'm suggesting that's what we need, and I'd be happy for a reaction from the panel. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure that we're even a question then. I think everybody was nodding their head because, you know, it's not our fault, but I think we've got a question here, yeah?
Yeah. Well, I'll keep it really quick. There's two kind of viewpoints in this city about the housing crisis. One asserts that there is no housing shortage. You see it come up a lot. I mean, there are good people that will argue this. In other words, there's no lack of accommodation. The problem is one of allocation, you know, the wealthy overconsume property and so on. The other view argues that it's a mistake to imagine the rate of house building is outstripping UK household formation. So, cutting to the chase, I was really pleased to hear Andy just make this great kind of plea for massive council house building programme in this country. Because there is a massive political problem that will block that, of course. We know that the UK is not short of land. It's only 1.6% of land, including gardens, is given over to housing. It's a scandal too. The big house builders act as a cartel. Let's face it. And the horrible truth is successive governments support the cartel, and the Tories rely on their donations, for Christ's sake. So I said the question was really to Andy, you know, how do you navigate these two views? There is no housing shortage, say a lot of good people in this town, and including in the council, and there absolutely bloody well is, and we need to build council houses, says the other.
There's an affordability crisis. That's what the problem is, and the allocation of housing is controlled by the people, for the people with the most money. And I was brought up in South Africa during the apartheid era, and I remember when I was about 10 years old, my dad, who was born in England, used to say the problem with the 1945 government, Labour government, was they didn't nationalise land. Now, as a 10-year-old, I had no idea what the 1945 Labour government was all about, and I certainly didn't understand the concept of nationalisation. But as I got older, he was absolutely right. And we have to think about those matters, those things that are essential for a civilised society. The right to housing, the right to warmth, the right to food, the right to for water. Just the things that have been privatised and that are failing us so dreadfully badly. Whether it's discharges into the rivers and the seas from the water companies. I could rant forever on some of these issues. But unless we have a complete rethink as a country. We're not going to turn this corner, and unless we do build publicly owned housing, and I'm not excluding community land trusts, I'm not co-ops and things like that, I'm really supportive of those, but we need to do something on scale. And that will make some really difficult decisions. See David Gibson at the back, a Green councillor. I would advocate building on the Downs. We've done it in the past. I would build between Falmer and Woodingdean. Sorry, there's Nicole's at the back, and she's a councillor for touching on that area as well. But we do need to recognise, but we can't just build any houses. We can't build the houses for people who want second homes. It has to be publicly owned, publicly controlled, and it has to remain in the public sector with rents that are affordable and tenancies that are secure.
I have a question. It's in relation to sort of health, people's health when they're homeless, addictions. We've got a very visual problem in the city. People sort of, I see it because I just live on Grand Parade, so it's right in the city centre, and I'm constantly seeing people running along the road, scrounging for drugs. There's heroin, it's some of the most serious drugs, but what impact is the drug issue having on the city in terms of, you know, what impact they're having on the council, all of the other services like the police, the ambulance service, you've got all of those services, what impact is that issue having on that? And then secondly, you know, how do we overcome those issues? Because surely they're a manifestation of existing trauma or something that's happened from the past. So how do we heal those issues and get people through the system? Because we've heard housing first before, but I'm just wondering, is there any other ideas that you guys have got? Thank you.
I think Tim and then
Lee. It's a great question and a huge one. I think so often the answers are the same, but what was interesting during COVID, of course, wasn't it, was that that street homelessness, rough sleeping, ended overnight. You know, this problem that is impossible to solve, that we're never going to get rid of, just magically disappeared because there was a political decision that we wouldn't let people sleep on our streets anymore, that we would offer them somewhere. And all it took was a political decision. And then what we found was, by providing people with somewhere warm and dry and safe, with support, with 3 meals a day, with doctors popping in to check you're okay, with substance misuse workers popping in with mental health support, that people started finding the time and the space to explore what was going on in their lives and try and make changes. And for too long the attitude has been, sort yourself out and then we'll try and find you somewhere to live. And of course that's what Housing First is trying to unpick, is we're not going to demand that people change their ways and then maybe they can earn somewhere nice to live. We're going to give people somewhere to stay that confers dignity and respect and makes them feel safe and helps them to start healing from some of the trauma and distress they're experiencing, often through being homeless. And then shock and horror, people start addressing their medical needs, their mental health needs, start asking for help with their addiction. And it's it's been twisted the wrong way around for far too long, which is that we ask people to get better and then we'll give them somewhere safe to live. And so that is the huge change that has to happen. But also what has to happen in this city is that we need to stop dramatically reducing the services. So I started working at what was then, it had a different name, but Homeless Early Art Shelter 12 years ago, and there was a far better substance misuse service then than there was now. There are no more mental health professionals working in homelessness now than there were then, even though there are far more people experiencing homelessness. So the provision of specialist services has been decimated in the last 12 years, and we know lots of that is due to austerity. But what I would argue is that we have, and this is different to 12 years ago, we have a bunch of councillors now who I believe really have their hearts in the right place and really want to see change. And I think we as a community need to gently apply pressure to the Labour and the Green councillors to work with each other as much as possible, but also to address that there is a problem in the council. there is a problem. It's the place where ideas go to die. And that things get mired in process and in meetings and in another 5-year plan and in this is, let's come up with another homelessness reduction plan, and it'll be printed in 2 years' time, and then nothing will change, and then we'll do the next one. And there's an unbelievable lack of output from a council which is actually represented by progressive councillors. But so there's something that needs to be addressed in terms of how the council is run, and I genuinely believe this because things haven't changed for 10, 20, 30, 40 years in the city. And there is the potential, we're going to hear in just a moment, aren't we, from Preston, and there is, with these wonderful groups, local groups, there is the potential to do things really differently in Brighton, to harness all the creativity and the imagination and the energy of the residents of the city. And what we need is the council to start moving with the residents in terms of the imagination about what could be possible. And I absolutely take your point, Andy, that we're fighting against the tide because nationally things are getting worse and worse. But we do see examples of cities where they're bucking the trend and where things are improving. And we're not one of those cities yet, but I think we ought to be.
So I literally just wanted to add very quickly that I think one of the huge issues is that the council doesn't listen to the individuals that are presenting to them. I've spoken to a number of people who have said, please don't place me in a hostel because I'm a recovering addict and there's people in there that are doing drugs. If you don't listen to those people and you don't understand that they very much fear that they are going to go back to that same place, they are going to start experiencing those issues again, then it doesn't really sort of matter what else is sort of put in place because this is just going to keep going. It's just going to be a revolving door of the same issues and the same problems. Obviously everyone's talked about Kendall Court, and it's the same thing with all of the emergency accommodation in Brighton. People are being placed in hostels that are hotbeds for similar issues, and it's not going to be addressed until individuals are listened to as individuals with specific needs and specific problems.
Well, we've got one more question, yeah?
It might be a short question because I think everybody has just said some of the questions that I was, they've already answered them pretty much, but I just wanted to add some more comment, I guess, to the fact that I work for the Clock Tower Sanctuary. We support young people who are homeless and insecurely housed up to 26 actually, sorry. And like what we see with some young people, supported accommodation works very well for some young people. For some really traumatised young people, much as you were just describing, Hannah, like going into some of those settings with other traumatised young people who may be using drugs, especially if they're deemed high risk, and then they get put into adult supported accommodation, they get put into William Collier House, so their drug use escalates. It just isn't working. And also there's a lot of revolving door homelessness for some of these young people. They just can't cope in that kind of setting. Housing First is great. I've no idea how we get anyone referred into Housing First, because we've got young people who've been homeless since they're 16. They've been in and out of all of the supported accommodation settings in the city. They can't cope in there. I heard a story from one young woman the other day where she won't have a shower in her flat because she's got her own pod, like with a locked door, but she shares the facilities with another young woman who has her boyfriend round. And I mean, she doesn't say why, but she said she can't use the shower because if she hears the voice of the boyfriend outside, she just can't be in that space. We've had other young people in supported accommodation. They can't manage sharing facilities. They can't manage having food in a kitchen because they may have not had access to food when they were a child, so they hoard their food. There's so many reasons that people can't cope in these settings and they end up getting kicked out again. So that's one thing I think we need to think about, especially for young people, is having some alternatives for them that are more not independent, but supported living, but in their own space.
Like Housing First is the model, really, isn't it? I mean, we just need more of that. We need it available for some young people who just can't cope. I think the other thing is, and I wasn't here for when you spoke, Helen, and I don't know who's coming next, so perhaps this has already been talked about, but there are some amazing examples of like communities who have campaigned to take over spaces. There's one in Brighton, I think, like up just off Lewis Road, where Bottega Rooms is. Audio Active has taken over the bottom, and then I believe that there's co-op flats above, which are more affordable, or are they guardianship? I don't know, but anyway, I know there's flats above. Also, there's a project in Hastings called in the Observer Building, where they have within the local community to try and prevent gentrification and local people being priced out of their city, because that's happening in Hastings now too. They've taken over a building and they've got 15 affordable spaces and they can have housing benefit there. There is a way, I think, if we rely on the government for systems change. I don't know. This is a unsympathetic government that we have, and it's all about profit, and it's all about them lining their pockets and the pockets of their cronies, as far as I can see. So I think there needs to be more of a community-led approach to trying to take over some of these spaces that might be going to property developers, and to get in there and to remake those spaces for communities, to remake affordable accommodation for those communities, community spaces where people can go. They don't, end up having to go to an artisan cafe to pay a fiver for a coffee, things like that. So more comments.
I'm just going to say very briefly, I think where you're talking about on the Lewis Road is a property guardianship. I think there are like masses of issues with property guardianships and how they work. Something that I'm quite interested in and have always been quite interested in is rather than accommodation being let to property guardianships to take care of, the council could work with short life co-ops. There are examples of that in the city who are much better at organising for their tenants and so on and so forth. So you could look at moving it away from that kind of, property guardianship is an extractive model, right? It makes money for the people who are doing it and provides awful conditions. And that is a way that you could look at kind of using some of those buildings that you're talking about already, but through a structure that tends to put people first. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting possibility.
Yeah.